The wheel of time turns and ages come and pass, leaving memories that become legend. Legend fades to myth, and even myth is long forgotten when the age that gave it birth comes again.
Welcome to Through the Glass Columns, a Wheel of Time read-along podcast. Each week, we will be reading, discussing, and digesting a small selection from Robert Jordan's fantasy opus. This quest is led by Tylor, a true Wheel of Time warrior.
I have all stories, ages that were and that will be. And I'll be joined by Greg, a complete novice to the Wheel of Time.
The Wheel of Time and the wheel of a man's life turn alike without pity or mercy.
Join us each week as we read the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time, traveling deeper and deeper through the glass columns.
But what does that even mean?
No. You don't get to find out yet. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Through the Glass Columns, your weekly Wheel of Time read-along podcast. I, of course, am Tylor, your host who has read these books before and literally was shaking with how excited I was to start book 4. And I am joined by Greg, who is probably regretting his decision to continue co-hosting this podcast for a 4th book. Greg, how are you holding up with my enthusiasm reaching terrifying proportions?
Actually, now that you mention it, my hands were also shaking. It's just because I have really weak wrists, and this is a fat book. I am great. It is really always exciting when we start a new season and start out on our new journey. And, I think our devoted listeners have had a couple weeks without us, and hopefully absence made the hearts grow fonder. And we will also, wink, wink, pretend we have also taken some weeks off. But it's really kind of fun to track our progress through this and to see how excited you are for this book in particular has me excited. I think the joke in book 3 was that every week you were like, and we're almost to the good part, and we're almost to the part I like. And I suspect that will be a shorter journey from book start to things you like, but I'm willing to, be surprised as we go.
Only a couple more months until I stop being the parrot that only knows how to say, it's coming. It's coming. I promise. It's coming. I think that we should probably start today with a big picture view of this chapter, right? I want to kind of think, generally speaking, about how did this chapter land? Should it have been a prologue, etc.? And the first question I have related to that is, was this chapter too long? And this is both a question for you as a reader, but also something that I want to make sure our podcast listeners are involved in. So why don't you briefly give your thoughts on it, and then also describe some of our plans that we have for figuring out whether this chapter was in fact too long?
Sure. I think just generally speaking, dear listeners, if you've paid attention to this, I think we might be the only ones who do pay attention to this. We usually make the line around 30 to 35 pages. And if we go beyond that amount, we break it up or do fewer chapters. Or if we're way below that, we see if adding the third gets us about to that range. This one pushed it a little further because it was one chapter and we couldn't break it up. So this is our highest word count / page count ever for an episode, which is about 39 pages in my mass market paperback edition. To me, that's fine, but I'm a reader. I, knock out a lot here and there. I will say this chapter felt a little long, which I think had more to do with the many POVs, which we'll get into shortly. But I do think it's worth asking our listeners what they want us to do. And part of our reasoning here is that as Tylor mapped out the months ahead, there are some weeks where if we kind of push our number to more like 40 instead of 30 to 35, then we can have a smoother run at other times.
Yeah.
Whereas if we don't push it to like 40 pages, we might have some weeks that are really thin otherwise.
To make this
that about
less,
right?
That is absolutely accurate. To make this less hypothetical, there is a particular point that I am worried about 2 or 3 months from when this is airing, where our options are either have a 40-page week or have a 16-page week. And there's not really a lot of ways to smooth it out beyond that. So to some degree, the question we're asking isn't, was this a really long one? Absolutely it was. The question was, if we have the ability to either go way short or this length, is this onerous enough that we would prefer not to go this length? And so I would love to get this answer from you. If you are listening on Spotify, I am going to make sure that there is a Spotify poll attached to this episode. Please respond. And Greg, you tell them whatever you are going to do on social media places, because that is not my responsibility.
Well, dear listeners, I will do absolutely nothing until Tylor says, "Hey, today's the day you said you would do that thing." At which point I will hurriedly from my office at work put a Instagram post up. And whenever you see the page for this episode drop, which again will be mid-morning the day it comes out, although I don't think I'm in the office the day this comes out, so I'll still drive in and commute in just so I do it there. And then people can just respond in the comments and tell us there. If I'm really on top of my game, I'll throw it into our Instagram story and do one of those live polls as well. So try to let us know. Please vote one place, not all of them.
Yeah.
And we want to know if what your reading habits are. I think a lot of people are splitting these up in ways that doesn't really matter to them. So we
Yeah.
will accept the up to you guys response as well, but we want to make this comfortable for all our audience, or as much of our audience as possible.
Yeah, and I also just want to note that this is actually going to be a nice barometer for us, both in terms of how much you guys are reading and how, you feel about, the quantity that we're putting out in this week in particular. But also, I just want to note we are going to keep this poll open, and this social media post should be searchable and possibly pinned for, let's call it, years. Right. We would love to, even if we are getting this data from you, if you're like, oh, I don't know, I'm listening to this late. If it is before 2030, we would love to hear from you about whether or not chapter 1 of book 4 is too long in this book. Please chime in. Community is a good thing. Let's build it, even if it's years and years late.
Totally fair, although also totally overwhelming that we'll still be doing this in 2030.
I know. I
But
did that math earlier and was
yeah.
like, no, that's horrible.
Once the world is a baked, baked, charcoal. I don't know what I'm trying to say. Hey, everything will be over, but you can still download our podcast. So,
Yeah.
hey, Tylor, I think if that's all the business, I would very much enjoy if you could take us into The Shadow Rising, book 4 of the Wheel of Time, for the very first time. And Tylor, I would like to make a secondary request. Since this is one really long chapter, let's not have a summary all at once, but let's break it down into each point of view. So
Yep.
start us off with your summary of the first character. And Tylor, make it seem like you didn't tell me that was what your plan was prior to this episode recording, and that I just made you do it on air because I'm the dictator. Go ahead.
Yeah, that sounds right. I'm willing to accept a bit where we immediately become taskmaster and I am the person who created the show and yet am subservient to you. I actually want to begin not with a summary of the first section. I would like to read you the first section in its entirety. That being said, it's not the first section that you think it is. The shadow shall rise across the world and darken every land, even to the smallest corner, and there shall be neither light nor safety. And he who shall be born of the dawn, born of the maiden, according to prophecy, he shall stretch forth his hand to catch the shadow, and the world shall scream in the pain of salvation. All glory be to the Creator and to the light, and to he who shall be born again. May the light save us from him. That's solid prophecy. Any thoughts on that before I dive into what is probably a summary that will last longer than that reading of prophecy?
Very beautiful. Found right after the table of contents. If people somehow skipped to after the map and missed that entirely. I think the only question I want to ask about it is I see that this is circa 325 AB, the third age. And am I correct to think that AB is after the breaking?
That is correct. Let me then
and
give
so
you
the third.
let me
Go
then
ahead.
give
Go
you
ahead.
the extra credit question. This is the hard one, right? This is we're challenging you now. 325 AB is approximately how long before the story we are now reading?
100 years. I have no idea. And he was taking a sip of
2,700
water.
years. So that
And the confirmation I was looking for is that the third age is still our current
it is the
age. We
current age.
haven't
That is correct.
left this age, but we are much, much later than this, far before any of these.
That is correct. Our really simple Robert Jordan, as much as it is an impossible to remember history of the world, does do a nice job if we are at the beginning of the book and reminding us of how time works. He has divided things into easy 1,000-year chunks. 3,000 years ago was the breaking of the world. 2,000 years ago was the end of the Trolloc Wars. 1,000 years ago was Arthur Hawkwing and the War of 100 Years. About 15 years ago, or I guess about 20 years ago, Rand was born, the Aiel War. So 325 AB, 300 years after the breaking, 2,700 years ago. I got to do math on my podcast. I can call this something I did for work. Now, I suggest that we begin the summary of Chapter 1, Seeds of Shadow. Unless you had anything else to say about that prophecy.
Only that solid prophecy, as you said, he shall be born of the dawn, born of the maiden. I really like born of the dawn as coming from the far, far east of the map, right? To me, that's how I interpreted that. To be born of the dawn.
I like that. I will just also note that he is known
Oh,
as
no.
he who comes with the dawn in Aiel prophecy.
Right, right. And the Aiel are from the far east side of the map
Yep.
from the dawn. So yes, you anticipate correctly that I was seeing this as a kind of merging of the two prophecies that we've experienced, right? The people looking for the dragon reborn and the people looking for the Aiel, the bring come Dawn Man. I don't remember what you just said.
He who comes with the dawn. I will
He who comes
also
with the dawn.
I will also note the other half of that pair, right? Born of the Dawn and Born of the Maiden. I really like because it sounds like what this is describing is a virgin birth a la Christianity, but what it is actually describing is someone who is born of a maiden of the spear, which is another piece of Aiel prophecy that we learned in the previous book. So all of this fits together really in a lovely way. It kind of highlights the difference between what I was about to call Western prophecy, which I guess is accurate of the Aiel versus Westlands distinction, but feels a little odd because we think of Western as, like the Western hemisphere, and that doesn't make sense here. All of that is to say, really interesting to kind of play with time and different parts of the world and how they're coming together in this prophecy. Chapter 1, Seeds of Shadow. Wheels turn, a wind blows, and the wind blows across Dragonmount. We get a brief description of the history of both Dragonmount and Tar Valon, and the Wheel of Time, we are told, turns around the White Tower. There are only a few people who actually venture into the tower other than Aes Sedai, and Min is one of them. She has her hood up, she's wearing a dress, she's been growing her hair out, and she is doing all of this to avoid being recognized by Aes Sedai, who otherwise might know Min because she has spent time in the tower before. She notes that there are fewer men here in the tower because only women traditionally seek out the help of the Aes Sedai due to superstition around the ideas about men channeling. And she also notes that in the kind of waiting room that there really aren't any class divisions. She describes a farmer and a merchant sitting next to each other and kind of, being more cordial to one another than otherwise likely would have happened. She is approached by Faolain and Accepted, who we've met before, and she says that she has a question for the Amerlin seat, and Faolain leaves to basically go figure out what to do after trying to dissuade her from asking the question directly to the Amerlin. We do get our first clear description here of the Aes Sedai face and how people can kind of not put an age to them. They look both mature and young at the same time, and that as she's studying the Aes Sedai face, Min begins seeing visions everywhere. She sees three different individuals with skulls or fissures or blood, and she has a vision that all of them are going to experience violence on the same day. And as she waits, she sees a number of other Accepted and Warders and Aes Sedai, and all of them seem to have these kind of violent visions about them. At this point, a another girl named Sarah comes and escorts her to the Merlin's office. She again starts to see a number of visions, including a new one about an Aes Sedai who has a silver collar around her neck. And at this point, she runs into Gawain in the hallway. Gawain recognizes her, asks whether or not she knows where her sister and Egwene are. At first, Min kind of panics because she's worried that they haven't arrived at all. But then Gawain explains that they did arrive and then left a second time. Min says she doesn't exactly know what's going on, and we get a little bit of detail about Gawain and Galad and their training, and a number of kind of details about how they're feeling. Most notably, Gawain and Galad clearly both still have crushes on Egwene. Seems to be an important message here. They then Gawain then leaves. Min tries to kind of enforce to him not to talk about her being there. And then Sarah realizes that she is very late. They get to Lyanna. Lyanna is clearly a little bit upset and sends Sarah away, pulls back Min's hood, recognizes her as Min instead of Elmindrada. And then we learn the meaning of the word Elmindrada. It is the name of a character in stories who is kind of a great beauty and, a lounging, not especially smart person. And that's why Min wants to distance herself as much as possible from that view. She then goes in to see Suan Sancha, the Merlin seat. At first, she feels awkward having to curtsy, but then realizes that it's a much more informal meeting than that. But Suan immediately demands answers of her. She gives all of the details that she knows, and then they start talking about Min's visions. In particular, the idea that all of the people will die on the same day. Suan first kind of considers the possibility that it will be a battle, and then they discuss the possibility that it will be white cloaks, but Suan eventually settles on the most likely possibility, or at least the most immediate threat, being the Black Aja. And so she decides that Min, because she can hide herself as Elmindrada, is someone who can basically spy on the Black Aja, try to see if there's anything going on, observe the goings on in the White Tower without being noticed. And so she comes up with this idea that Lyanna is going to kind of paint her face and make sure that she looks like, just the girl that she's supposed to be with that name. And then she can do all of the spying and continue wearing the dresses and keep her, kind of guys up. Min initially resists, but Suan realizes that Min is in love with Rand. We get a little bit more detail about the vision that Min had about herself and Rand, that Min would be loved by 3 women, but there was no guarantee that Rand would love any of the women back. And then Suan is able to basically spin a web of, if you want to help Rand, you have to do it by staying here. And she is eventually convinced. And we end the chapter basically with Min saying, you always get your way, don't you? And the Merlin saying, yes, I do. That was a lot of summary, but I think a really interesting section of this book. There was a big chunk of it that I was like, this would make a really good introduction to a horror movie. What was your take on this extended, but I think pretty good Min segment of the introduction?
Yeah, there was something kind of cinematic about it. It's not quite Sixth Sense, but you often get those things where a character flashes somewhere and sees something, sees people dying, or sees somebody's future in this way. And I will say, I think it was a partial chapter that needed you to pay pretty close attention.
Yeah.
There were times where I was so eager, say, for her to get into the office that I would find myself kind of skimming a paragraph. But the real meat of it is in those little moments, in those little descriptions. And I think your summary captured that nicely, that
Yeah.
if you want the real intended effect, you have to be paying attention to every little bit here, not just rushing to get her to the office to have the discussion, though the office and the discussion are good as well. I continue to find myself interested in what Min's full journey is here. It has felt increasingly like she keeps getting used, and by the end of this section, it's like, here's somebody else who now just sees her gifts and just
Yeah.
wants to use her to her end. Now, it's a noble end to fight the Black Aja. That's a good thing, but at the same time, it's like, well, when does Min get to write her own story? When does she get to
Yeah.
figure this out? And the problem, I think, is that the only part of her own story that seems written is that she's going to fall in love. And that just falls into kind of icky stereotypes of
Yeah.
female characters in fantasy, even though I think Robert Jordan has already earned our trust in some regards.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for me, the version of this that comes out early in the chapter is if we're talking about Min, like how much she's in control of her actions, the simplest measure of this early in the chapter is the fact that Min is wearing a dress, right? If there is one characteristic we have about this girl, it is that she wears pants, and everyone comments on the fact that she wears pants. And so I think that is exactly the right read, especially early on. She just feels out of place and uncomfortable. And until she starts seeing visions, there's a solid like page and a half, 2 pages that is summarizing what has gone on in previous books. A wind blows through Tarvalon and Min feels uncomfortable. And I think that's exactly kind of the takeaway from a character perspective for her. The only other thing I had early in the chapter was just this kind of interesting custom that anyone who wants to can come to the White Tower and seemingly request an audience with the Merlin. And while it may take forever, it was odd that she got in immediately. Apparently, it's not that odd that it will eventually be granted should you want that request. I just think that's a cool little detail that harkens back to, some traditions in like Christian and I'm sure other religious, ideologies. But it works really well here as a piece of world building that doesn't get a lot of attention, but really kind of holds up to looking at. I feel like it feels lived in, not arbitrary.
Yeah, it's the big block of cheese from the West Wing, right? That
Mm-hmm.
on a special day at the White House, I think it was Jackson, who we are not going to praise for literally anything else other than this, perhaps,
Mm-hmm.
where they would have a big block of cheese in the lobby of the White House, and anybody who wanted to come in and share their problems works on that. And then West Wing turns this into a couple different episodes of just random weirdos coming in to talk about their business. It does feel more to the point, like you said, of like a monk or something. I know there was a Neil Stevenson book, I think it was Anathem, where they had like a monastery built around a mechanism of a clock, and it was like, when the doors all aligned,
Yeah.
then the person from the innermost sanctum would come out and greet the people and answer whatever questions they have. And, prior to the full alignment, the next circle out or the next circle out. And like they could
Yeah.
only get so far. And so, yeah, I think that's drawing on this same tradition. To me, it felt a piece with the three vows, right? That
Yeah.
they took the vows so that they could not harm the world, essentially, that their power was governed by something. And this felt like another way. If you
Yeah.
are, it's pure democracy. If you're answerable to the people at any particular moment, then you would hope you would act with restraint towards those people.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that harkens back to just the definition of the word Aes Sedai, right? I think we learned in an earlier book it means servant of all. And so it makes sense that they would let anyone come to them for service. A couple of kind of interesting details jumped out to me in kind of the next section before we really kind of really get to the study or to Gawain. Number one, we get our first real description of Aes Sedai aging and the fact that it looks a little bit different, right? We get this description that Aes Sedai, after they've been channeling for enough time, they kind of look mature in the eyes, but continue to stay looking young otherwise. And it kind of apparently makes it difficult to put an age to them, but also apparently makes them easy to identify, even if they're not, say, wearing a ring or any decoration that shows their Aes Sedai. I think of this as like a minor retcon, but one that has been kind of hinted at now for long enough that it's kind of earned the full definition it gets now, even though this is not even remotely true in the first book at all. No one recognizes Moraine
Hmm.
as an Aes Sedai, despite her face not being covered. The other thing that I just really quickly wanted to pull out of here is there's a very quick moment right when Gawain initially arrives, where Gawain is doing the thing that all of the characters have done so far. He's trying to figure out for himself where everyone is and kind of piece together the information he doesn't have. And then Min has a really interesting response. She's like, "Do you really think those girls need looking after?" And Min thinks that it's because Gawain doesn't know what's going on. But there's a part of me that found that line really interesting, just in the sense of Min being one of the character, or at least one of the only female characters we've talked about who doesn't have some sort of power that lets her influence the world or be powerful in the traditional sense, right? She can see visions, but otherwise she's just kind of a girl. And so I thought that was a really telling moment for Min as a character. I thought of it as before Gawain, even though I guess it's a line to Gawain. Did anything about either that kind of pseudo retcon or that kind of line of Min's about Elaine and Nine or and Egwene, did either of those kind of stand out to you?
Min was just a girl standing in front of a boy telling him to not worry about the other girls. Uh
I really thought that was going in a no doubt direction for a second. Okay.
oh no, I went Notting Hill. Come
Yeah.
on. Which part of the 90s were you in? But I like that I didn't know the rest of that line. I knew the first two lines as a part
Yeah.
of it. Uh, we went to the Notting Hill bookshop this summer almost by accident. We were walking down a street and saw this mob of people. We're like, "What is this mob of people?" And it was basically a bunch of loud Americans who just
That's
wanted
fun.
to step inside the bookstore and then walk back out. Uh, yeah. So I look, I said I was trying to get her to the office, and the last thing I wanted to slow me down was Gowan. It was like I
Yeah.
still don't care about this dude, and I don't care about his problems. And I think you're right that the most generous read on it is there is this kind of fun interplay of like who's steps behind whom,
Yeah.
and like it seems at first that Min is far behind him, but then no, he knows that the women actually did return and then left again, whereas she doesn't. And
Yeah.
I really don't care that much about Gowan and how he's perceiving these events.
Yeah.
Though I think it is a mistake on my part to not care, right? Like
Yeah.
he's not exciting to me, so I don't care. But the fact that he continues, it's like he's one circle out, much like
Yeah.
Min was. Min was one circle out and is now kind of on the inside circle, whereas Gowan is like three circles out and he keeps coming closer and closer to the main plot. And I suspect he will have important things to do eventually in this story, which is why we keep getting reminded that he exists. But this also kind of felt like one of those moments where it's like, let's just remind everyone he's sitting around the halls and then we'll catch up with him in book 5. So that's
Yeah.
my hope, maybe.
Yeah, I think the only other thing in this section that stood out to me is Gowan gives us kind of a really interesting note. If we have been thinking about our main characters as kind of leveling up in the past couple of books, right? Egwene is learning all sorts of new skills, and all of the other women are, their channeling abilities are really coming along. Rand is now channeling in ways that he never would have before. Perrin is learning to talk to wolves. Matt's lucky, I guess, right? But everyone has things advancing. It's worth noting Gowan and Galad are also advancing. We get just a really
Hmm.
quick note in this section that the last time they battled, the person who trains warders, Gowan won 2 out of 5 in a duel, and Galad won 3 out of 5. So these are now characters who they may not have magical powers, but in terms of the sword, they are now beating the people who trained Lan, right? Lan has probably surpassed his teacher, but that's where these two like 18, 19-year-olds are in terms of their skills. We should be paying attention to them for that, if nothing else.
And correct me if I'm wrong. We don't know the exact process of when an Aes Sedai gains a warder, but it would feel like we have 3 Aes Sedai advancing in their skills who are going to need warders pretty soon.
Yeah.
I don't know if when you hit a certain level, you get gifted one with a little bow around them, but we have 3 ready to go, right? And ready to get bumped into that should the process need to occur.
I like the idea of just being gifted Gowan, just like, here you go. We didn't want him, which is kind of how a lot of readers feel. Uh, we
Oh,
then
great. Did you get a receipt with him? Because, uh, well, and I do want to just ask because I'm getting confused in which multiverse of Wheel of Time we're in. On the show, they have made it very clear that there can be romantic relationships between Warder and Aes Sedai.
yes.
Has that also been clarified in the book?
It has. So our kind of
Okay.
warder Aes Sedai chart, if you will, is reds never have warders. Greens often have warders, sometimes marry their warders, and sometimes have multiple warders. All 5 other Ajas have warders, but rarely marry or romance them, and always have one at most.
And so I raised that question just because whereas he's still swooning over Egwene, there is a potential future, as you just said, if she were to be a green Aja,
Yeah.
that she could be a romantic partner and they could have that relationship.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the interesting thing for me here is that Gawain continually seems to be the one that all of the women are talking to about Egwene. And yet Gawain seems to be kind of continuing his track of deferring his kind of feelings for Egwene because Galad also has those same feelings, right? So I think you're exactly right to say we're setting this up. We don't know if it's coming back later in this book or book 5 or when, but I think we've talked before about Robert Jordan doing his like tiered progression of characters where first you just get mentioned and then you show up and then you get a POV. And it feels like if this is Min's first like full chapter that she is carrying on her own, Gawain is like a couple of steps below that in that progression. We're now starting to get detailed descriptions of him instead of brief descriptions, but that's still a step up for this character compared to where he was before. Any last
Yeah.
thoughts before we get to the thing that you were apparently really waiting to get to? Because we're about to get to the Merlin study. What did you think about
Let's do
Siwan
it.
Sancha here? Anything especially stand out to you of interest? Was she fishy enough? Was she not fishy enough? I know this is a character you have very particular tastes with in terms of her accent and aphorisms.
Definitely caught a few. There's a big net reference.
Yep.
There's some fish stuff. So yeah, we weren't there long enough to really get annoyed by it, and so on. Didn't go full Sarah Palin, which is how I still kind of think about her.
Yep.
Is like,
Yep.
you know, I Sarah Palin is not a current reference to our students anymore because they were
No.
like 7 when she was important.
Yep.
But I recently referenced because I was trying to explain the word colloquialism.
Okay.
Like, remember Sarah Palin when she resigned said only dead fish go with the flow. So I think that's what aligns those two characters in my mind.
Yeah.
But I much prefer the Amaryllin seat. I thought this felt actually a lot like a Moraine moment where it's like the Amaryllin seat is
Yeah.
moving at so many levels beyond Min that we, from Min's limited perspective, really can only get a taste of what's going on.
Yeah.
And other than that, I would just say a part of that, I guess, it's not unrelated. Is like she's all business. She's like, let's just take care of each of these things and let's just keep things moving. So
Yeah.
I like that. I like that we just kept going and got through this. The fact that she's kind of alarmed at how fast things are moving
Yeah.
is alarming, but in all cases, she says, I can't believe Moraine's doing that already. And
Yeah.
so, because I'm so in tune and trust Moraine, it's like, yeah, well, catch up, baby. That's what we're doing. That's what Moraine wants.
I had the same reaction. I think there's a lot of things in this chapter where you can look at Suwon and be like, that is just a selfish kind of jerk move. But I think because she's so tightly aligned with Moraine, every time my reaction is like, okay, yeah, that was a jerk move, but I get why you're doing it. You have that same single-minded attention to a goal that Moraine has. The one moment that I thought was really telling here is when Min is telling Suwon about her visions. Suwon's immediate response is, well, I hope it's something that's not going to happen immediately so I can change it. And Min immediately, her recollection in her head is only 3 Aes Sedai now know about this ability. Varen wanted to study it, Suwon wants to change it, and only Moraine has ever understood that the things I see can't be changed. And I thought that both kind of emphasized the similarity between Siwan and Moraine, and also kind of maybe we should be a little more skeptical of Siwan than we have been. She's aligned with Moraine, but at least in this kind of like fundamental understanding of Min, at least she's falling short of the standard that Moraine has set.
Yes. And that made me feel a little protective of Min, right?
Yeah.
That like watch out for this person. And I think because Min voiced the skepticism herself, it's like, well, Min doesn't need me to tell her that, right? Like
Yeah.
doesn't need protecting. She's pretty wise to what's going on, pretty savvy. But it did feel like again, if you are gonna get used by somebody, I don't know if this is the person you want to get used by.
Yeah, and I think what that was the interesting kind of thing at the very end of this chapter to me is we have seen multiple times now, whether it's Nynaeve or Egwene or I think briefly Elaine and even Matt and Rand, we've seen all of them just like bowled over by the Merlin at one point or another, right? There have been several chapters that are either from Suan's POV or someone else's POV that are just her getting what she wants by saying things and not stopping until someone gives in. And so to me, it was really striking in this chapter to see that happen once again, but from the perspective of someone who's savvy enough to know that they're being played and figure out what
Mm.
the objectives are and just realize, like, oh, yeah, she really did set this up in a way where the thing that's in my best interest is also exactly what she wanted. Like, this is the first time we've seen this from someone who knows the game well enough to describe it to us. And I found that shift to be engaging enough that I didn't mind. This was like the Merlin choose someone out chapter number 7.
Yeah, you kind of stole right where my head was, which is I was thinking of in Game of Thrones, there are the kind of naive characters who bumble
Yeah.
into the game and just get destroyed, and then there are the people who think they know the game, and then you get like the Varys, who's like behind the scenes really manipulating things at
Yeah.
such a base level. And I don't think there's a quite an analogy to Min there because she's not manipulating, but she reads it at the level of a character like that, where she understands it really
Yeah.
deeply, and can see the actions almost. Well, that's cliche, but or
Right.
not cliche, but it's a bad pun to say she could see it before they happen. But
Yeah.
for a totally different reason, she can understand these things before they happen.
So I think at this point I have covered all of my things that I had stars next to, but there are a dozen other little details that you could potentially pull out of this section, right? There's a debate about the White Cloaks and the Shan Chan. There's, a decent length discussion about how Suan has decorated her office. And I thought that was actually a really kind of interesting portrait of her. There's just a lot going on in this section that I've condensed down to a few things. But was there anything that you wanted to pull out or that was especially kind of exciting or interesting to you before we move on to the other POVs in this chapter?
I'm going to do the opposite of what you just asked and say
Okay.
that what came across from all those little details plus the flashes, which you summarized, but we didn't talk too much about. Just, I felt like the point of this section was to really demonstrate that Tarvalon is no longer safe and
Yeah.
that something big and bad is coming this way. And I would say, in thinking of the job of a prologue as making you want to read the rest of the book, that's very effective, right? Because then
Yeah.
they immediately guess White Cloaks or Black Aja. And I went, okay, so it's not the White Cloaks or the Black Aja or the Shan Chan. Like, it has to be
Yeah.
something else. And so my mind in those moments went to Rand and the Aiel, which we know
Mhm.
are coming together and have fought against Tar-Valon. Well, Rand hasn't, but the Aiel have
Yeah.
fought up to Tar-Valon.
Correct.
And so in the reshuffling of the allegiances that happened a month ago in the book we last read, then I think there's something more to see here, and I think
Yeah.
it's something that they don't necessarily see coming. So
Yeah.
that's what I took from all the little details you mentioned, or some of those little details.
Yeah, I think that's a really good reading. And I think there is one word that you said that I just want to briefly address. This chapter should have been a prologue. I firmly believe the
Oh.
only reason it wasn't is because he had a really, really good The Wind Blows for it. And it was like, okay, it's chapter 1
Mm.
instead of the prologue. That's what happens in chapter 1. I have no evidence of that other than it feels right. Next POV. Elida almost recognizes Min initially, intercepts Sarah and tries to figure out what she learned or saw, dismisses her as not knowing anything, and then lets her leave. She kind of then realizes where she knows Min from, recognizes her and her association with Moraine, and then she starts to piece together a number of kind of different things from her past. The first thing we learn is revelation. We know that Elida can foretell, but we learn that one of the first foretellings she has is that the royal line of Andor would be key to defeating the Dark One in the last battle. And so that's why her focus for so long has been on advising Morghese, and now why she seems so obsessed with finding Elaine. We also learn that not only does Elida remember Lan, but that there was a link between him and Moraine, and also that she seems to be one of the few who remembers that Moraine and Suan used to be close friends until they abruptly stopped associating with each other shortly after they became accepted, which she notes couldn't have been much after Rand was born. She then starts thinking that Suan is not fit to be a Merlin, and as she is muttering this to herself, she comes across Elvieren of the White Aja, and she begins a conversation with her about Suan that first Elvieren seems skeptical, and then she becomes more and more concerned. She eventually asks whether or not Elida has anything concrete, and Elida says no, not yet. An ominous sign for what is to come in the White Tower. A shorter section, which I appreciate for my recap, but also one that if before we were talking about Min going from maybe like a stage like 3 character to 4, it feels like Elida has now moved up a stage as well, right? Getting a POV and now seeming to be central to this plot line is not something I would have expected from a character who previously had some ominous lines for Rand in book 1. What was your take on this section of this first chapter?
Just remind me, Elida is red.
That is correct.
Yes. And so when we met her before, it was very much kind of a threat, right? Like
Yes.
somebody who could undo this. Yeah. I mean, again, I feel you're right. This isn't a prologue, but it is a very good early chapter because this felt like, okay, this intrigue is continuing as well. And, you know, so much of what you just talked about, Suan discussed the kind of court intrigue
Yeah.
side of Tar Valon. But there was a way in which you might think, since the Black Aja GTFO'd,
Right.
that there would be less going on here or less of a threat. And in some ways, this feels like less and more of a threat because it's less in that it's not somebody who might just assassinate her, but
Yeah.
it's more because it's somebody who is essentially lawful good, we question mark, but
Right.
following the laws is lawful, and following the laws and enforcing the laws of the order, which is a much faster way to take somebody down
Yeah.
than, create a martyr and so on. I don't know if all my analogies worked right in there exactly right,
Yeah.
but it does feel like this is a real danger to the Suan's power.
Yeah.
Maybe not to her person, but to her power.
I am about to conflate the White Tower and thereby the Catholic Church with the mob, and that would be an absurd conflation to make in the real world. But let's imagine that we were thinking of Suan Sancha as similar to, like Al Capone. I think what we're basically saying here is she is spending so much time fighting the FBI agents that she is ignoring Elida, who is basically the IRS coming to get her for tax fraud, right? Elida seems to be the less important of all of the threats, but that doesn't mean it's not going to be an important threat. It just means it's less scary than the other things that are out there. That being said, other than being a really interesting kind of character portrait and giving us a new wrinkle on the story at the White Tower, the real new interesting piece of information for me is Elida's foretelling that the royal land of Andor will be the key to defeating the Dark One. What was your take on this foretelling or any other details in the Elida section?
Um, Not much. So I think I was stuck on the fact that it felt a little Deus ex machina to suddenly be like she could piece together the Rand story from the outside, right?
Okay, yeah,
Now we don't have any kind of previous moments where like she was working on it. She might have been working on this for the full year, 2 year that this story's been going on.
yeah,
But to suddenly be like, wait, we need a threat, so we need somebody to kind of very quickly put together these pieces.
yeah,
That felt like power inflation in some way. And so the foretelling within that kind of becomes a way to hand wave away that don't worry, it's okay, we can
yeah,
say it was magic. The Star Wars equivalent, or the equivalent of the Star Wars, it was the Force
yeah,
type move. And so I kind of again was concentrating more on this is a real threat. This is a bit of foreboding. I don't know that I felt it was a real threat to Rand, but just to Suan.
Okay, that's totally fair. I think the only other thing that I will note in this section is that today is one of those days when I just have words that I need to throw out that might not mean anything now, but may be important later. I just want to note if Elida is getting a promotion to POV character, Elviarin of the White Aja is getting promoted to character whose name we should be remembering in future chapters. If she is the first person who's hearing this from Elida, odds are pretty good that she will come back at some point in Elida's whatever evolves from this discussion. Any last thoughts about this section before we move on to Dane Bornhald and the White Cloaks?
No, let's go to the Two Rivers.
Dane Bornhald
Or
watches.
just outside the Two Rivers. I saw your hesitation. I saw it. People can't see the video, but your looks. Go ahead.
Dane Bornhald watches Jarrett Beyer intimidating a number of villagers. He thinks about the advice that he got from his now passed father to threaten violence but not commit it so that there would be no trouble from the villagers. They are in the edge of Andor, crossing a ferry, and as you referenced, they are making their way into the Two Rivers. He is told by one of his subordinates that Ordieth was talking to 3 Tinkers, and now none of them can be found. There are apparently about 100 Tinker wagons that are currently being guarded by only 6 children of the light, and Dane Bornhald thinks of them as not much of a threat. However, Ordieth, who we met in the prologue of the previous book, said that initially when he saw them that we should kill them because they are of no use. And then when he is asked by Dane Bornhald what happened, admits to questioning the Tinkers, but says that he let them go and asks why he is so why Dane Bornhald is so distrusting of him. Dane immediately assumes that the Tinkers must be dead, and is very concerned that if they are not, that they would have gotten away and could warn Andor and lead to an army pinning him in the Two Rivers whenever he exits. He then realizes that it is all worth it because even though Ordieth is insane and he doesn't know why he is being forced to work with him, there is one thing that makes it all worth doing, and that is the fact that he can now trap Perrin of the Two Rivers and get him to come to his home village. This is, I think, the most intriguing because it takes a bunch of characters we've seen in other sections and puts them together in interesting ways, right? If Min and the Merlin are the big chunk of this, and then we've got 3 small sections, this to me was the best of the 3. Is that your take as well?
I might go with the third just because there's so much new there, or else so much that I had blissfully forgotten.
Yeah.
But I did think this one was really good, and it was a reminder that these white cloaks at least largely sat out the last book, right? We had kind
Yeah.
of parties of white cloaks down near Tyr. And you did just allude to the prologue of the last book.
Yeah.
But it very much was like we didn't follow these pieces that much, and the Tinkerer sat out the last book as well, so
Yeah.
it was nice to see some of these words again,
Yeah.
and start to put them together. I mean, my 2 takeaways, and you hit both in your summary, were the Two Rivers is not safe and they're hunting the wrong guy.
Yeah.
And I think that it reminds me of late in Return of the King. They have is it Perrin's cloak? I think they have the wrong Hobbit cloak, and they
You
no,
mean
no, it is
Pippin's cloak?
Frodo's. Pippin's, sorry,
Yeah.
Pippin's cloak. No, but it is actually the mouth of Sauron comes out of Mordor and
Oh, yeah.
shows the cloaks or the badges. So we know that they pretend they've killed the hobbits to disenfranchise the army. But that kind of mistaken identity thing, right? That
Yeah.
they know they're hunting a boy from this region, but they are on the wrong track. In this case and in that case, it's like, well, how just being that little bit off track isn't gonna be that hard, right? Like
Yeah.
you start burning the Two Rivers and word gets out, and both of them are gonna come running. It's not like you'll just get Perrin and then be disappointed.
Yeah, and I think the interesting thing for me then is the mystery of what exactly the plan is here, right? Because it's clear, like, I think the phrase they use is immediately evocative of Tolkien. I think they specifically refer to scouring the Two Rivers. But that being said, how that will draw Perrin specifically feels like something that still needs a gap filled in somehow. And so I left this chapter feeling like, okay, I can see this developing. We've gotten, I think we, if you've recently listened to our previous episode where we recapped the previous book, there were a lot of visions in that book about the two rivers and white cloaks. It feels like, hey, there's some momentum in this direction. It's happening. But I also feel like I don't know quite enough of the story to feel satisfied. I want more, I guess, is really what I'm saying here.
Hmm. On the thread of the Tinkers, yes, they're probably dead, but could that be a way to get the word back to Perrin,
Yeah.
perhaps accidentally? And that was the thread I felt like could be pulled to, but he's very far away.
Yeah.
They all are. I mean, they're all together very far away from here. So
Yeah.
I'm curious to see how it goes on. And it's very interesting to me just also that this continues to be the Bornhold
Yeah.
family that caused this problem. And maybe I was thinking about the name of the next chapter earlier, which we will reveal in a moment for people who didn't see it. But I think we've used this metaphor before, thinking about the Taviran as ships. And when a ship
Yeah.
passes through water, there is the wake. As things continue to kind of spin and twist in their wake, which of those pieces ends up doing something really damaging? And, that's, I again, when are we recording? Nobody knows. But I've been thinking a lot more about Doctor Who lately for some reason. And to me, those are always the really good Doctor Who stories where he does some, or she, but the doctor does some little thing at some point, and it comes back to kind of compound on the him in some really interesting, unique way. And this is evocative of that it's like, yeah, you accidentally pissed off this one guy who then got his son to seek revenge, who's then hunting down your families. And
Yeah.
it's very interesting.
Absolutely. And I think if we are kind of thinking about how far afield our characters at this point are, right? We're talking about how far Perrin is from the two rivers and what have you. This is actually a really good time to pull out our maps for an unofficial, not really full, ill-advised discussion of visual media on a non-visual podcast, because the next and final POV of this chapter takes place somewhere that is actually not labeled on the map. And so I want to make sure we know where it is. So if you take your...
I searched so hard. I just wanted on the record. I was like, where is this? I took the names. I couldn't find it. So I'm very glad you're starting here. So tell us where it is.
If you start on your map at Falm, where the end of book 2 took place, on the end of the penis of the continent, and then go directly west through the compass, you will find a small group of 3 islands. I do not know which of those islands this section of the chapter is set on, but the port is on one of those islands that is traditionally held by the Athan Mir, the sea people.
And so these would be like I forget which family in Game of Thrones, but the Iron Islands. So it's like the seagoing folk, fisher folk who kind of control these outlying lands. Notably, this would place it between, and that's what I was trying to figure out, if the Shanshan had returned to the continent, not on the penis, but somewhere alongside. There is a little because it says it's at like Half Moon Bay or something. So there's a little down near Tanchico. There's a little bay. I'm like, but they just say Tanchico, so it's very helpful. So I see these little islands. So these islands. So again, well, let's do your summary and then I'll ask all my questions about this because I was intrigued by a few things here.
Absolutely. So we join High Lady Suroth, who is looking over this harbor, and she is guarded by the Death Watch, which at first brings her kind of honor, and she thinks of how powerful she is. And then she also thinks of the danger of the Death Watch because they don't actually serve her. They only serve the Empress. She then thinks on the heights, the paths are paved with daggers, which is apparently a common saying of the Shanshan. And then she notes that she is on a sea folk island, and she has been trying to keep the word that she is there from getting out so that the mainlands don't know that they have regrouped. She notes that she has rallied all of the forces that are fleeing from Falm. She has not been able to find all of the ships, so it is almost inevitable that word has gotten back to the rest of Shanshan. But she has at least been able to gather most people and thinks that she will still be able to continue the Hyleni, which is the return, the push by the Shan to kind of retake the land that was lost. She also thinks about the dragon, which she initially thinks of as the dragon, and then briefly thinks it must be a false dragon. But she kind of imagines taking and capturing him. She thinks of what must be done in order to make the Empress forgive her for the failures that have already been happening. And then she turns her attention to three women who are bowing in the room. Two of them are Suldam, and one of them is Damane, the Damane Pura, who we have met before. We knew her as Rima, the Aes Sedai. She tells her that if there was a man who could channel, the Aes Sedai would gentle him and they would not make an alliance with him. She is then told to tell the truth. She cannot tell anymore, probably because of the Aes Sedai oaths. And then there is kind of a brief thought where Surath thinks that she no longer trusts Suldam at all, and that while she has sent word back to Shan, she has not included any word about what is going on with the Suldam because she doesn't want that information to get out. She thinks only 4 people know about it, and 2 of them are Suldam, who can wear the necklace, and so they won't be telling anybody. She then kind of thinks about how she is going to get back in the good graces of the Empress, the things that she can do. She refers to her as the Empress of the Court of Nine Moons. And then she also briefly kind of thinks about how if she does capture Rand, she could give him to the Empress, or she also could not. And that is kind of left as a hanging thought at the end of the chapter. So there's a lot of things going on here. I pulled out a couple of really weird phrases, one of which, the Court of Nine Moons, I can't give you any more detail other than to say you should know that that phrase exists. The other, however, on the heights, the paths are paved with daggers. The Path of Daggers is the name of book 8. And so it's worth noting that that is something you might just see on a bookshelf. And so I'm one of those people who, anytime someone says the name of a movie in a movie, I'm like, hey, they said it. And so it's kind of fun. Like they wrote it. That's the name of one of the
Mm.
books. What do you think about this last section?
So I think this was, like I just said, a very intriguing one. Again, another group that sat out a book. We knew
Uh-huh.
the Shan were kind of defeated. I think we had said repeatedly, it seems like they're not gone for good. This was, they lost the battle, not the war. And
Yeah.
so to have you fill in that they're kind of regrouping offshore and then headed back with greater strength. Forgive me if I missed this in your summary. Sarath was not a character we'd met before.
She had been kind of referenced in previous books. So
Okay.
Surath and Turok were kind of the two paired leaders of Falm when it was under Shan rule. And so Turok was killed by Rand, but Surath really kind of escaped any kind of negative consequences. The one thing that I do want to note, however, is that when not Varen, Leandrin, when Leandrin took the girls to Falm in the second book, when they were captured by or when Egwene was captured by the Shan, there were some pretty heavy hints that Surath was Black Aja along with Leandrin, and that's how that exchange was arranged. And so we are likely not only looking at someone who is faithful to the Empress, but also someone who is likely faithful to the Dark One. And so that might give some kind of extra kind of flavor to the ending where we're debating whether or not the dragon would be given to the Empress. The alternative might be, the Dark One.
Mm. Interesting. I kind of had read that as she was perhaps out for herself. So I'll take that clue from you and help with that. My other question that I alluded to a few minutes ago, I think you answered. So I was wondering because they say Pura,
Yeah.
who used to be known by a different name they don't use. So you said that's Rima, who we have met, but
Yeah.
I was kind of wondering, like, oh, is this a hint that this could be somebody like really important that we met? Like, could this be a Varen or somebody of that rank? But you're saying it's kind of a lesser Aes Sedai we've met previously.
Yes. So we actually heard a little bit about Rima in the second book. She had been captured by the Shan shortly before Egwene was captured. And so we actually got a few scenes, I think, when Egwene was being trained or tortured, depending on how PC you would like to be about it. She kind of had kind of a parallel training to Rima, and Rima was kind of broken in a way that Egwene seemed to resist for significantly longer. So this seems to be kind of a step further on that. She seems to now be more or less fully Pura as opposed to Rima of the Yellow Aja.
Cool. Well, and I'm excited then. I guess my only other thought is I'm excited to see this Sean Chan back around.
Yeah.
Again, we're on the opposite side of the continent. So this feels, if we're to take all these sections together, this feels like it's going to be a big book. And I don't
Yeah.
mean that in the fact that it's 1,000 pages, but meaning in that it's very sprawling with multiple fronts. Whereas all of the books so far have been driven by a small group.
Yeah.
This really feels like we might deal with a much bigger story and across the whole continent, and that's really exciting.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of where I was at is if this is a book that is all about promoting characters and promoting plot lines, what are the things that have been sitting out a book or two that are coming back? What are the things that felt, kind of minorly important in previous books that we are now saying are actually very important? And to some degree, I think the most notable thing about this chapter is that Min is the most significant character in it. And so, if nothing else, we are kind of just getting out all of the minor characters and fleshing them out in a way that I really feel like we haven't in previous books. In general, this is what I love about this book, even if it is still going to follow a little bit of the pattern of the introduction is relatively slow. It's just setting up things and doing world building. When it's this deep, I don't mind. Is there any last thoughts you had on this introductory chapter before I tell you to go and read the next chapter because it's even better and that will continue to be my lesson for weeks and weeks and weeks?
To keep it PG for our rating, I will just say let's effing go. It's really exciting and it's a good start. I would say among my favorite starts. It felt much less recappy
Yeah.
before, and that's often where a fantasy book series gets. They all have to play a little of this game, but it's like, hey, if you're reading this, then you must be in.
Yeah.
Kind of is the feeling. And while they'll remind you of a couple things along the way, it seems much more committed to let's just keep building and expanding. So, unfortunately, though, it's another one chapter next week again. So, the next chapter we'll read together next week is Whirlpools in the Pattern, which is just a hair shorter in my edition than the current chapter. Does have a very exciting chapter icon at the top of it, which we'll probably reference next week. But one more chapter, which already gets us I think like 75 pages in.
Yeah.
And in my head, 75 is basically 100, and 100 is like 10% of this book. I'm like, 2 weeks on 10%. Let's do this. So, but that's not how numbers work. So we will take our time getting there. We hope you enjoyed it. And welcome to our new season. As always, you can please reach out if you have any feedback you want to give to us. DMing us on Instagram is probably the way to get to my attention the fastest. Tylor is unknowable. He is a puff of smoke on a breeze. But if you try to grasp him, he just slips through your fingers. But I will spread the word to him if you get a message to me. So all that being said, I made him laugh too hard. So that means I have to say, see you next time through the glass columns. So ends another episode of Through the Glass Columns. We thank you for joining us and continuing with us on our quest to cover all of the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time.
This podcast features original content developed by Tylor Orm and Greg Cass and is not in any way affiliated with, associated with, or condoned by the Robert Jordan Estate, Tor Fantasy, or Amazon. All content is intended for entertainment and educational purposes only.
If you're enjoying this podcast, please seek out the books from your local bookshop or library and join us as we continue our journey. If you'd like to contact us to share your thoughts or give feedback, you can email us at throughtheglasscolumns@gmail.com or find us on Instagram and Twitter by searching Through the Glass Columns.
Thank you once again for being part of this community. If you're enjoying the show, please subscribe to the show, leave us a review wherever you're listening, and recommend the show on your social media to help us grow our community. We look forward to welcoming you back next time through the Glass Columns.